to think about the body as a form of articulation. So you know that the word ruthmos, sort of, in its most ancient meanings, is associated with the positionings of the body and dance, and arthron with its associations with articulation and jointure, also as defining the body. So I wonder if we had read your paper through the lens of dance rather than voice, if that would change something. And then another place is in the passages from Republic 2 and 3, to which you drew our attention, where the connection between gracefulness and the sort of total cultural environment that is to be produced by the censorship of craftsmakers is being cashed out and argued for, but in reversal to the order in which you presented in the laws. That is that the capacity for logos is bolstered and shaped by the early conditioning with graceful objects and graceful music. So there it seems it's not that the human is the model. The human requires intervention, and a specific intervention of the polis, in order to come to the capacity for logos that could serve as the model. And that just strikes me then as, you know, even if Plato isn't posthuman, he certainly isn't a humanist in any real sense of the term either, right? I mean, when we get these sort of consistent statements that a human is not very important, that the human is limited, that the purpose of the human is to become godlike, there it does that. I wonder if that challenges the sense in which the human is the paradigm. And then the final place was in this question of the organic structure of logos and the logical structure of organisms. So you rightly point to that wonderful Phaedrus passage, but there's also this place in the Phaedo, right, where logos is treated as organismic precisely because it is mortal, right? And the concern in the Phaedo is that the logos, not Socrates, will die. And so there it seems as though, again, there is a kind of autonomy attributed to logos that makes us have to think carefully about the echein in the human being being the creature that has logos. So maybe you could just tell me what you think.
That was a great series of questions. And I'm not going to do justice to them. So beginning at the end, there's a certain autonomy attributed to logos in Plato. I think that's right. And so I was actually trying to move toward that autonomy by talking about a human logos, which would, in the end, become the same as, begin to reflect this more autonomous logos. Now, that logos is, however, I can persist in calling it human because we do not find that attributed to animals or any other being. It is a human logos that is a reflection of, that begins to mirror or imitate a much more autonomous logos. I think that's exactly right. So let me just begin there and then go back to your comments about dance and music. It is the case, you're right, that I said much less about dance than about music. It is the case in the laws that they're treated together. They are treated as both forms of orderliness, of taxis. One, the orderly production of sounds, and the other, the orderly production of movements. It seems much easier to claim, as I did, that music is calibrated upon the human voice than dance. That seems a much more difficult point to make. And yet, I wanted to argue that order itself, for Plato, is inevitably related to logos, to the human voice. How I got there then was to argue that all order, that even the order of things, so to speak, the way in which things or organisms are ordered, is a reflection of the order that one finds in logos. So you mentioned the arthra, the articulations of the human body in dance. It's not a coincidence, it seems to me, that in the Phaedrus, when Socrates is talking about a logos that would be organized like a zoon, it's exactly the fact that it has arthra that organize it in such a way. So even there, I see a way for the dancing body to be, as I was using the word, calibrated or indexed upon a form of order that is itself related to logos. So I was trying to, in a very strong way, I admit, drive everything back to human logos, a human logos that would in the end not require the attribute human insofar as this logos does become precisely autonomous from any individual human. It becomes the measure of both the rational human as he or she speaks about things and the measure of the things themselves. And that was the final move of the paper, was to show the way in which that logos would not be distinct from a thinking of a certain divinity. And the passages that I tried to point to in the end about the human walking in the footsteps or being like a god seemed then to characterize that autonomy of logos that goes beyond any mere human, but is still nonetheless very strongly marked by the human. So that was the argument.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, Michael.
Yes.
As well, I wonder if you would consider the cicadas as a perfect posthuman, because they are sort of they were crazy for singing, and they were transformed in singing cicadas. And cicadas are worse than the sirens, because the song of the sirens has meaning. It is a narrative. It is like poem. On the contrary, the cicadas are just singing and singing without meaning. So you would consider the cicadas some images or metaphors of the posthuman as a singer, as a radical and total singer, without meaning.
Wonderful question. I don't know. In the way in which you just presented the cicadas and the Phaedrus, I can see why one would want to claim that they are a conception of post or pre-human voice detached from any kind of signification or any kind of meaning. But as they're embedded, nonetheless, in the Phaedrus, I see them as being, and again, very strong claim, like other, if not all animals in Plato, I see them being put to the service of a Platonic argument. So Socrates uses the cicadas, he interprets them, he interprets these meaningless sounds in a way that, that advances the dialogue with Phaedrus. It is also interesting, speaking of, coming back to the final paper, there is a way in which that passage with the cicadas, looking down upon Socrates and Phaedrus below them, there's an echo of the, what's it called, the Tekoscopia of the Iliad, where the old men are looking down at Helen, and they are chirping like cicadas as they're commenting upon the beautiful Helen that walks below. So if we're supposed to hear, then, the cicadas are interpreted by Socrates in this way, but also a Greek reader would have also seen these cicadas as having yet a supplementary meaning. They are looking down upon Socrates and Phaedrus in a very similar way to the old men looking down upon Helen. So I see them as being, yes, in a certain sense, ciphers for a sound without meaning, and yet they get filled with meaning in the course of the dialogue, it seems to me.
Probably the same.
Oh, yeah.
2 days ago, I saw a biography of Mr. Heinemann, the father of homeopathic medicine, and they said it was when he moved in, which Johann Sebastian Bach had been the head capital of my state, had just died, that all of a sudden that was the right place to be, saying that it's so drenched in this king of musicians, aura of music, that it enabled his natural medical approach to, that science to flower. And I'm thinking, wow, is this a jump? You're, in a sense, promoting pilgrimages it's anti-scientific, the homeopathy. He says rational, and certainly it's not scientific. You've got to think, well, wait, maybe he's right. Vienna, the greatest Roman music, created the great geniuses of that period. You can make that kind of an argument. I'm thinking, are we going into a world of rationality, or are we in a world of a certain kind of rationality? And I think it's coming out of that Platonic argument that music as the king of the arts has this effect on the mind of man that's necessary.
I think maybe John will have something to say about that at some point. The only connection I would try to make, it's not to homeopathy, but I focused at the very end on the famous Homeric phrase, "The God ever brings like to like." And I guess one question would be, does that dictum, does that phrase ever get contradicted in Plato, or is that always the guiding thought in Platonic, in the Platonic dialogues? And it has extreme consequences for how we read everything if Plato does or does not follow that like and like always come together.
In the distinction in politics between lovers and men, also opens up to speaking to, speaking with, and creating a community of people who know, who can talk to each other about what is good and bad and harmful, and as opposed to the other animals, because they are the options of disease, the other animals who simply have a phoneme through which they express pleasure and pain. So, how about the communication part of this practice? And what does it do to the pleasure between human beings and non-human beings?
And the other question for Ramona is, do we take it seriously?
That's the question.
I mean, I must confess that my own usual take on the allusions or invitation of this voice in the dialogical moments has always appeared as something of the same order as precisely I'm a butterfly. Let's do a session of midwifery here. So, am I totally wrong? Because, you know, on the other hand, you have François Piston saying this is a practice of trends. So, you know, the hyper-serious interpretation of Socrates is someone who really reinforces and really was functioning in this parallelistic manner. So that is the extreme hyper-realistic way. I tend to go in the way, the other direction.
Well, I understand why you do that, and I think Martha Nussbaum reads it like that also in her argumentation with Vlastos, that she wants to see it as an ironic moment, and that the irony is precisely pointing towards the elenchus. What I wanted to do was to resist readings that either take it hyper-realistically or ironically, and see how we could read this as a symptom of something else. And I wanted to see it as having us think of Socrates in relationship to himself that we don't see often going on. So I resist the ironic meaning, the ironic reading, but I can't deny it at the same time.
I mean, it's more than compatible because certainly Socrates wants his dissident to think that there is otherness.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Absolutely. That's absolutely right.
Performance of now enters the other.
But what would you see that otherness as if you read it ironically?
How would I say it?
The otherness as, if he's pointing towards something,
Has a way of casting himself as the afterthought, as
right.
precisely the erupt, the articles, the
Mm.
one who doesn't teach but listens to, because he listens to the voice, and then tell me your definition of Ekes and let me disassemble.
I see. Yeah. So it isn't incompatible at all. So I should really just think. I should think more clearly about that. I'll try to work that through a little bit better. Thank you. In terms of your first question, you know, I hear what you're saying, but part of what I'm struggling with Plato these days is that his incapacity to listen. So that I wonder if these really, you know, people have been already talking about this, how dialogical are the dialogues? Are they, you know, so when are those moments when Socrates listens? And that's why the listening to the daimonium is so fascinating to me, and so I'm struggling to even say what seems to happen when it becomes a dialogue, and I can't articulate this further, is at the moment that the reader has to step in for the way in which Socrates has closed off dialogue to his interlocutors, so that we set ourselves up as the ideal listener to Socrates. And Socrates has to respond to the better question that we give. So I'm still hesitating whether I want to read it dialogically. There are traps, yeah.
Right here.
Well, I kind of want to disagree with you a little bit. I think the dialogues of Plato are inherently dialogical. And to me, that is part of what makes it interesting to work with Plato's text, is that it is inherently difficult to speak of Plato's views or what he is saying, because he lets different voices speak in the dialogue. And even in the dialogues where maybe there are not different characters giving voice to the different arguments, like for instance, in the Parmenides dialogue, where you have the huge second part of the dialogue where the one is hypothesized, whether it is or is not in relation to itself, and the other, it is kind of a lot of different arguments coming into to speak, or they are given place, the different arguments, and it's not resolved. And I think the in-between in Plato that is created by these differences of the different voices and the different arguments and standpoints that are given place within his text, it is what makes him interesting to read.
Yeah, it's also for Ramona. I mean, I guess my thoughts is, I mean, if one does take the daimonium seriously, right, it's having a kind of constitutive role in the sort of inner form of Socratic life. I mean, on the one hand, the work it seems to do is, you know, to kind of constitute, you know, the subject retrospectively, a kind of fidelity to a certain kind of inner experience. And yet, on the other hand, to also place the subject in a, you know, a position of trust, right, towards some kind of, you know, futurity, future intervention that hasn't yet happened. So I guess I
guess I wonder what you would say about that. I mean, if you think it's more one than the other, or you know, how one sort of thinks about those two together, because it's insofar as it's the latter, right, a kind of modality of trust, then it's also what isn't imitable, seemingly, about
it's
what's inimitable,
mm-hmm.
right, about the Socratic life,
mm-hmm.
right? Right? I mean, so I'm just curious.
Well, I tend, in terms of, to think about, to be more interested in the unpredictability of the voice, so that of not knowing when it is going to occur, and the kind of way in which that destabilizes Socrates, of him not knowing. I don't know if this is answering exactly what you're thinking. So that it's somehow one of those moments where there's something beyond control that controls him. And that what I was indicating in the way I was thinking of the problem, but I will be curious what you have to say, was that it's a moment when he trusts to another that we don't see that type of trust going on. Now, with him otherwise, which on the one hand compromises his moral autonomy that he's so interested in creating. But the inimitability is a really good question, and I wonder if this is a place where we kind of reach the limit of being able to imitate him as a figure. I don't know if that's what you were indicating, or...
No, that was it. But also whether it's really it's really proper to think of a kind of proper to think of the relationship to the daimon in terms of, this term we use, privatization, such that it would really be a modality of trust. Right? Because on the other hand, there is a kind of suddenness, right, in the manifestations of the daimon that seem very different from the kind of familiarity and kind of retrospective fidelity, right? So it's fidelity that's kind of past-oriented, and there's trust that is kind of future-oriented. I wonder if you really think it's, it really reaches the condition of trust.
I think I have to think more carefully about that. I had been assuming that it had reached the conditions of trust, and that was what was odd about it, that we don't get any explanation about that, but yet it is the condition of trust. But I'd like to discuss it further with you.
So one more question, back.
I wanted to press a little further on one of Sarah's points at the beginning about the question of humanism, or to what extent you think about these figures as posthumanist, and so forth, particularly in relation to the divine, which figured in all three of your papers. And it struck me, particularly in the context of the American material, the idea of the kind of animation of nature and so on and so forth. The sort of further back we go, pre-Platonic in ancient thought, the kind of assault on the subject, or the sort of questions that are raised about autonomy or sovereignty and so on, are so often formulated in classical use in terms of the divine, in terms of the human relation to the divine, limits of subjectivity, and so forth. So I was wondering, given that, and therefore I think it's quite easy to think in those terms of antiquity being posthumanist or anti-humanist in some form or other, what that does in terms of our modelling of a posthuman antiquity, whether in terms of kind of contemporary debates in which the divine functions in various ways, what does it, if we find an antiquity a resource for the critique of the human, is its implication in questions of identity something that we think through in modern terms as well? Those questions.
Should I start? I think I agree with you that there is a lot of potential in going back to the earliest Greek material. At least to me, some of the fascination with the texts of Homer and also Hesiod is that the descriptions there of what we would call the human and the divine and the animal, they are so fluid and they are so, in a way, similar to each other. Just one example from the Iliad, when Patroclus is killed, there is a section there where, I mean, there is a lot of description of the sorrow of the friends and allies of Patroclus. But there is also one section where the horses, the two horses and the carriage that he has used in the fight, the horses are standing there grieving for Patroclus, with tears streaming from their eyes, and they are named by name, just as the heroes are named. And the way that these horses are depicted, it's so similar to the way the heroes are depicted. And also, of course, as everybody knows, the gods in the way they are described in Homer, they are very, very human in a way. So there are fluid borders there that I think are really interesting to look at if we want to move away from some of the ways of thinking in our, I don't know what to call it, Christian or post-Christian or Muslim or, well, the world that we live in have thought divinity very differently. And we cannot erase that, of course, but there are other ways of thinking of divinity than what has become so familiar to us.
Maybe I can pick up there on the question of divinity, because I was comfortable talking about an anthropocentrism, but not humanism, because the anthropocentrism I was trying to get at is one whereby the human is assimilable to the divine, at least a part of the human is assimilable to the divine. And I would want to reserve that conception of humanism for something which places the value much more intrinsically in the human, apart from the divine. So I wouldn't want to think of there being a humanism in Plato. There's an emphasis on the human and emphasis on anthropos, because anthropos is, as I tried to argue through, pointing to a couple of places of analogy, the human is to animals what the divine is to the human. And those analogies are, they're everywhere in Plato, and they construct a kind of very clear and solid and unmistakable edifice that separates the human and the divine from the animal. Puts the human from time to time on the side of the animal, but only a side of the human, only a particular side of the human. So I would, as I say, stay away from the notion of humanism. We could go in many different directions, but since you were talking about mourning, one place for me to think the difference between Homer and Plato is precisely on the question of mourning. Patroclus' horses and the emphasis on Achilles' horses and the importance of mourning in the Iliad seems to me countered by the absence of mourning and the prohibition even against mourning in the laws. And that makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense insofar as there can be no mourning for an individual with an immortal soul. So it's not at all in vain, or it's not at all surprising that Socrates would forbid great exclamations of mourning, both so in the Republic and the Athenian in the Laws. And if one wants to hear Socrates' discourses ironic in the Republic, then you've still got to deal with the Laws, where there are several passages, strong passages, that basically say, in the city-state there shall be no mourning, for precisely the reason that the anthropos is very close to the divine, and therefore it doesn't need it, doesn't warrant it, and it would be morally non-elevating to permit it.
Can I just ask you a question? What's always struck me in the Republic, I agree he prohibits it. This might take us a little far off, so we can be quick about it. But I always was, he doesn't prohibit it totally. He says you can mourn in private, so that there's somehow, it's the spectacle of mourning that really disturbs him. And he also proposes a whole set of regulations about how you are to mourn and what you are to mourn. So I'm just asking, I mean, I'm saying that I think he's yet again revising Homer and coming up with a new figure of, you know, a new type of Achilles at that moment. So I don't know if you agree. Okay, well, so I was just curious. It's not an absolute prohibition.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
right. Yes.
Excellent to end on agreement. Thank you very much. Thanks to our speakers again.